going to hope for the best, Jonah, because I don't think it doesn't fit in the box. It'll be okay, right? Does somebody have the sign-in sheet? Wonderful. Thanks, everybody who has returned, and anybody watching online, and anybody new this week. I'm looking, Barbara's new, Cindy's new. Anybody else? All right. So let's get started, because I know last week we had to rush through the end of it, so we'll just do the best we can. Oh, I have the clicker now. Let's see. So as a reminder, each week that tonight we are gathered on the traditional homeland of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa. They were stewards of the land long before Arlington Heights was settled by European immigrants. And remember, that is our land acknowledgement, not an official one of this congregation, but is used in Arlington Heights for different occasions. So I thought it appropriate, given our topic, that we remember who was here before us. So I already welcomed you, but I wanted to check first if there were any questions from last week, any comments, something that you had wanted to say and didn't have a chance to. Anybody? Jerry?
I did a little study after college while I was not doing. There are about 3 or 4 regular Native American parishes down there in southwestern Oklahoma.
Yes, there are. Mm-hmm.
And so I went into the Eastern Oklahoma website and found out. So
Nice.
they're still existing.
Yes, so I know Park Hill is still a congregation, small but still there.
Well, they're all small.
Yeah, they're all, I don't know that there's a large one anywhere, so. But they are still there and, you know, have a lot of spirit in them. So, thank you. Anybody else? Anybody else do a bunch of studying, reading?
I checked out 2 books about the Cherokee at the library.
Oh.
And then I chopped in, there's a Native American, all the tribes, all the tribes of the, you know, the different locations. And then it's like, some say the language is there, but some say it's like dormant or no dictionary or.
Right.
Yeah, it's kind of neat.
Right.
Each
So
one
after.
of them, yeah.
Right. So after Thanksgiving, when we, especially the week right after Thanksgiving, when we talk about the boarding schools, we'll address some of the people losing, the tribes losing their languages. And a lot of movement right now to revive that. So I remember I told you last week I was really hoping that, oh, there it is, okay. That I was really hoping that I could speak Cherokee to you by the time this class started, but I'm not quite there. Maybe by the end.
Do you have any living descendants of your?
Well, I mean, my grandmother is not living any longer. She died.
Oh.
So we have a lot of family cousins
Okay, that's what.
who still live in Oklahoma.
Okay,
Mhm.
that's good.
Yep.
Cool.
All right, anybody else? Great. So I wanted to review a couple things, and if you're new, then this might be a little bit new to you, and if it is and you need to stop us, then stop us and ask. But I wanted to remind everybody, last week we learned about the doctrine of discovery, very intro. As you know, there's quite a bit more, and it goes much more in depth. But basically, the doctrine of discovery is a theological, philosophical, and now legal framework dating all the way back to the 15th century that gave Christian governments moral and legal right to invade and seize indigenous lands and dominate indigenous peoples. And I took that quote right from a book called The Land is Empty. What? The land is not empty. Oh my gosh. I've had quite the day today, let me tell you. The land is not empty. I actually brought some of the books today, so if anybody wants to look at those at the end, you're welcome to. There are just a few of the books that I've really learned quite a bit from. But Sarah Augustine is working very hard to work towards dismantling some of the abuses of the land and things like that. And just a reminder of why our church is looking at this. And I won't read all of this, but a reminder that the Presbyterian Church, PCUSA, since 2016, has really been trying to educate our congregations and our members about the doctrine of discovery and really looking at ways that we can change that, what they call repudiating the doctrine of discovery. There are many denominations that have done that. As we talked about last week, it was actually the Pope that delivered the initial papal bulls that started the doctrine of discovery. The Pope has repudiated now the doctrine of discovery. And the PCUSA is asking congregations now, what can we do? And as faith communities, we need to really look at what we can do. So my hope is that by the time we get to the end of our 5 weeks together, we don't just say, oh, that was nice, and go on our way, but that we find ways to make a difference. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about some of the land removal. An Indian just moved off their land. But I wanted to talk first a little bit about what is the difference between the way indigenous peoples who were here long before us looked at the land and the ways that the European settlers who came in looked at land. Susan.
I have the sense that for most indigenous, the whole concept of owning land is just not understandable.
Right.
It belongs to its creator. It doesn't belong to human beings. We're fortunate to be on it and use its resources and give thanks for them,
But we don't own it.
nobody can own it.
Right. So when we think about the European settlers, or in the Southwest, the Spaniards coming up through Mexico, to people who did not see the land as something that they owned. It was all more like the circle of life, for a simplistic way to put it, that you are part of the earth. And we're all connected in the water and the sea and the land, the plants. There wasn't a thought that, oh, this is my plot of land and this is my plot of land. It was common land. And so then, all of a sudden, you get people coming in to this continent who thought of land as taking it over and it's mine, which is much more how most of us probably sitting in this room think. You buy a house that's on land, it's yours. And so that's the way that we think of things, and we're starting to get in a lot of trouble with our resources of land. But interestingly, when I was starting to learn more and more about this, I wondered, like, where did that come from, that especially the European settlers thought that they should just come in and take over. But what happened was that before the Crusades, also in Europe, land was the same way. It was common land. So they farmed. People were not necessarily, you could have a whole group of people who farmed and shared things. But as the Crusades started, once again, here we are looking at the church. Just like last week in the Doctrine of Discovery, the church was pushing the noblemen over the common people. And suddenly they were starting to take the land, and the commoners ended up not having land. And then what happened? They all came to North America wanting to own land. And so when we talk about, it was a commodity, basically. So you landed here, and already they had said if you weren't Christian, then we can take whatever land we want. And even though there were millions of people here, they could take what they wanted. Does anybody have any questions on that piece? Right. And smallpox, that.
Some of them had smallpox, some of them had other European diseases that killed them off. And so the population of the Native Americans in that area and their food sources dropped like a stone just from this one expedition.
Yes, so, and that happened all over. So smallpox, alcohol, all of those things were introduced through the Europeans coming into and moving into the land. And here we have these groups of people who, they weren't expecting any of this, and these people just show up. They thought of them just being part of the land, and they were living quite elaborate lifestyles. It wasn't, as we kind of hear, oh, they were merciless savages, like it says in the Declaration of Independence. Things like that, when actuality says that they had very civilized places. And I know there's a slide coming up that is going to show a Pueblo village that dates back to the 1100s. That, now there's not electricity and things like that, but they had farming, villages. It was very elaborate. They had their own systems of government. They were civilized, not like we tend to kind of hear and learn. It was not quite how it was. Any questions? All right. So, here's the picture. So I have a little video because we're going to start talking about what happened that when the Europeans or the Spaniards came up from the southwest, what happened that all of a sudden all of these people ended up on the other side of the Mississippi River. What, did they just gave up their land and said, oh, we think we'll move? No. So I'm gonna tell you a couple different stories of a couple different Indian removals and what happened with those. And at the end of hearing about some of those, I want us to really think about what does it say about the land, and what does it say about how we think about when we celebrate Thanksgiving. Is there something we can do differently? Is there, we're all going to meet with our families, and as I told you last week, so do Native Americans. But do we maybe think a little bit differently? Is there something we could do differently to answer some of these things that happen? So this is the picture I was going to tell you, and it's a little bit hard to see. But this one it'll be your left, I guess, right? That is actually, it's the Acoma Pueblo. It's one of the oldest civilizations in the United States. It's in New Mexico. It's up on a plateau. It is, you can go and visit there, but it's pretty much a sacred area, so you can't just go there and drive your car up there. But they will give tours at times. But it is really stunning. The other picture, you're going to hear in the video a word called a kiva, which is like a church. And some of you who maybe traveled in the Southwest have maybe seen these. I believe this one is actually in Bandelier National Park. So if you've been there, you may have seen that before. But these were sacred. They are from 1100s, 1200s. And these were the places that the Spaniards came in, pushing the religion of the day, which was Catholicism at that time. But it's not letting us all off the hook, because as we know, once the Reformation happened, the Protestants were doing the same things. But I want to show you this video. This is our first, this one, I think it's a great story. I did not know very much about this until this spring. But this is about the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. And it is why last week when I was talking about how the Pueblo people are not on a reservation, but actually their land is still in trust, but it is not a reservation. And the reason for that is because of a chief named Popé, who, well, you'll see what he did. I found this story fascinating, but I thought a video of this particular story. If you've been to the Statuary Hall in the National Capitol, New Mexico's statue is of Popé, the Pueblo chief. So you said it works, right? Oh, good. Okay. So we're going to watch. It's just about 5 minutes. Oh, and I should click it, right? All right, here we go. This video was done by a group of high school kids. So it's a little, but I thought it told the story pretty good. Oh, okay. All right.
And welcome to the student-produced. Hi everybody, and welcome to the student-produced Reading Through History knockoff video on the story of Popé's Rebellion. This project was produced by Ethan Foom, Christian Liao, and myself, Lucas Levy. We are juniors at San Marino High School enrolled in Mr. Ricconi's 2020-2021 AP US History course. In a nutshell, the Pueblo Revolt refers to an uprising of multiple southwestern tribes, aka the Pueblo, against their Spanish colonizers in 1680, 140 years after the arrival of the Spanish. But before describing these tumultuous times in detail, some background. When the Spanish first arrived on Pueblo land around the 1540s, Spanish missionaries attempted to dominate Pueblo life and force their conversion to Christianity. However, when the Pueblos resisted, Their kivas, the traditional ceremonial pits of the pueblo, and something similar to what we all today would view as a church, were burned by the Spanish with mass and other sacred objects also destroyed. Many also suffered greatly from the encomienda system, a structure that subjected the natives to long work hours and harsh living conditions. They were tried in Spanish courts and received severe punishments when convicted. Hanging, whipping, dismemberment of the hands and feet, or condemnation to slavery were common methods that the Spanish used to beat the natives into submission. In the years leading up to the Pueblo Revolt, grudges against the Spanish had been mounting. Many Pueblos were whipped and hanged for their purported use of sorcery and neglect of Christianity. It was then, in the year before 1680, that a native by the name of Pope, one of the Pueblo convicted sorcerers, was able to capitalize on these accumulated sentiments by putting a plan into place to revolt against the Spanish government. To start, he meticulously organized and formed alliances with other neighboring tribes. Each tribe had sought the independence, prosperity, and good health which Pope had promised in return for their support. Despite speaking different languages, the tribes were able to successfully communicate with each other and execute their plan. What made Pope and his army so successful were knotted cords, an innovative tool he had given to every tribe. Pope had deliberately instructed for the cords to be knotted the same number of knots and told the neighboring tribe leaders to untie one segment per day, until there were none remaining. On the day that the last knot had been untied, the Pueblo would attack the Spanish and overtake Santa Fe. And thus, in 1680, the Pueblo were able to successfully rid the Spanish with a total force of 8,000 Pueblo Indians from the area we have come to know as Santa Fe, New Mexico. The remaining Spanish who had survived fled from the area, and many casualties had been claimed on both sides. At the expense of the many sacrificed, the Pueblo had claimed the Midwest and Santa Fe for themselves once again. After their successful uprising, the Pueblo immediately moved to undo countless years of Spanish influence. Spanish documents and historical records were destroyed, churches were burned, and Christian marriages were nullified. Santa Fe was claimed as the newly founded territory's capital, and the Pueblo natives were free to practice their ancient traditions and customs. However, this didn't last long. 12 years later, the Pueblo people were once again subjects of the Spanish Empire. Despite the recapturing of Santa Fe, the Pueblo Revolt had a number of all-important short and long-term effects. The Spanish catered more to the living conditions of the Native Americans and permitted larger crop yields. Nevertheless, to prevent such a revolt of Spanish rule to happen again, they installed missions across the region in order to pacify the Native Americans and change their way of life. In terms of religion, the Native Americans practiced in secret, afraid that their beliefs would warrant punishment by their Spanish colonizers. However, as time progressed and living conditions grew worse, desperation caused the Pueblo people to convert to Christianity in search of sustenance and protection. Yet, the past carries on until today as Native Americans continue to suffer poor treatment by the government. Especially in the pinnacle search for racial equality and activism found in 2020, this broader movement has spread to the descendants of the Pueblo as well. An article by the New York Times explains how many of the newer generations are exploring their own past that is uniquely relevant as the country is riven by questions over historic racial injustice. Even today, groups are still being neglected. Especially in the wake of the pandemic, delays in financial aid towards Pueblo tribes are some of the deadliest phases of the present pandemic, indicating overall neglect in financial treatment towards Native Americans and minority ethnic groups. The Pueblo Revolt continues to stand out as a rare success in the history of revolts and has left an imprint on Spanish colonization in the region. As a result, many of the Native American tribes in New Mexico were able to keep their land and culture, unlike other groups who were removed from their homelands as superpowers pursued territorial expansion. In spite of the tumultuous Pueblo history, the revolt's biggest legacy is that it allowed people to remain in their homelands and maintain sovereignty, language, and culture. Thank you for watching the student-produced Reading Through History knockoff video.
All right, I gotta get back to my, you think if I hit escape? Nope. Okay, sorry, everybody. Okay. All right. right, so I'm curious, how many people knew about the Pueblo Revolt before tonight? It's okay. I had heard of it in the back of my mind, but until the spring, I really did not know the extent of it or understand what that meant for. I had heard of Pueblos before, but I didn't really have an understanding of exactly what that was all about. So I found that story to be fascinating, and the reminder, again, that there were people on this land long before Christopher Columbus or the Mayflower or any of those things landed here. So now we're, for lack of, remember I said we only have 5 hours to talk about all this history. So we're going to move up to when we're going to move out of the Southwest. We kind of saw at that time what happened in the 1600s. Now we're going to move to where the Europeans were coming across the Atlantic to the southeast, the northeast. So all the way from Florida up to New York, Massachusetts, there. And so really the arrival of the Puritans, when I was talking about how there just became this class system in Europe where people weren't free to practice their religions, or they weren't, economically they couldn't make it because of all different those kinds of things going on. They decided to come here, and because of the doctrine of discovery, they thought, well, as long as the people who are there aren't Christian, we can just move in and do whatever we want. And so the group that the Mayflower, as we all know, that's what's coming up next week, that was not, when the people from the Mayflower came here, the Native Americans really saw them as pretty disorganized people. But the Puritans saw the Native Americans, they needed them because they didn't know how to work the land, they didn't know how to do any of those things. But they also brought diseases with them. So our first, well, we have these rosy pictures of the first Thanksgiving. I really don't think that that's exactly what it was like. There was some dependence on each other for survival, and so some of that, but soon after that, there was still that thought that these people are not Christian and we need to turn them into Christians. And that was going on all through the southeast, all the way up to the northeast. I told you last week that I can't remember now, the 3 times removed grandfather, I believe, was Native American Cherokee, but also a Presbyterian pastor, trained at Princeton Seminary. But that's because the Europeans came in and they said, you got to all be Christian. That doesn't mean that they didn't keep a lot of their tradition, and they still spoke the language and those types of things. But as they moved on, they gained independence from Britain. What happened when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, and I'm sorry it's not written up here, but I had a little computer thing going on today. But the Declaration of Independence we talked about last week actually calls Native Americans merciless savages. So clearly, they were still thinking they needed to move these people out. When the Constitution of the United States was written and we think of we the people, who are we the people? Right, we talked about that last week. Even women are not really mentioned in we the people. The difference, though, is that Native Americans, if you go and read it, word for word, Native Americans are actually specifically, women are just not mentioned at all. And slaves are mentioned as being 3/5 of a person. Native Americans are actually listed in the Constitution as not being people, if you go back and read it.
How long did it take
What do you mean?
before they recognized it?
Oh, well, there's been, I mean, I guess it depends who you ask. I mean, there's been amendments to the Constitution over the years that Native Americans do have citizenship in the United States, but it took a long time. So we're going to start talking now about some of the, because of that, because they weren't citizens, they weren't seen as people, then what happened? So any questions on that? And you're allowed to disagree with me, so that's okay too if you want to. Anybody? Okay, let's move on. So in 1830, this was not that things weren't going on before this to move Native Americans out of their lands. But in 1830, the Indian Removal Act was passed. It was passed by Congress and President Andrew Jackson, my very favorite president. No, I'm kidding. Basically, the Indian Removal Act authorized the U.S. government to assign pieces of land and enter into treaties with tribes. So, but all of the land assignments were west of the Mississippi. Now we're talking 1830, so they wanted the land along the Atlantic, and they were going to move all the Native Americans west of the Mississippi. So they call the tribes' leadership in for all these different tribes, and they want them to come make treaties that they'll agree to move. So that's one piece of it. They've got to agree that they're going to move to wherever the U.S. government has said your particular tribe is going. And then you have to go. Now, I don't want to not say that they weren't offering anything to them. They were offering relocation expense, where they basically were saying, well, we're paying you for the land, or we're paying you to relocate. Pennies on the dollar. If any of you read, I think I brought some more, but if any of you read, I think it's this one. If you haven't, you might. This article here was in the Chicago Tribune quite a number of years ago. But it's actually about Arlington Heights and some of the treaties with the Potawatomi. It actually mentions one of the founders of our church and him buying this land after it was bought by the government from the Potawatomi. So it's an interesting read. Asa Dunton. So in the end, at this time, so 1830, there were 86 treaties made with 26 tribes. So basically those 26 tribes then have to go to their assigned land. Now remember, we're talking about people who didn't see land as something that you owned. So we're talking about people who are looking at land in completely different ways. And not everybody agreed that they wanted to go. So I think the first one, yes. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is the Trail of Tears. And I apologize that last week I brought up the Trail of Tears and realized afterwards that there were some people that didn't know what the Trail of Tears was, and I apologize for that. That's something that I've grown up with knowing about, and so I wrongly assumed that people knew that. So the Trail of Tears is part of the story of the Indian Removal Act. In the 1830s, there was a group of Cherokee. Now, the Trail of Tears involved about 5 different tribes. The Choctaw, I'm having a brain lapse here. But I'm going to tell you all these stories, I'm going to relate to specific tribes. There's many more of these removal stories, but we can't talk about all of them tonight. But there was a group of Cherokee Indians who went to Washington, D.C. because they thought it was going to be in their best interest to just move out of Georgia. Georgia had discovered gold, and Georgia knew about the Doctrine of Discovery, and they knew about the Indian Removal Act, and so they wanted to jump on getting the Native Americans out so that they could have that land. So there was a group of Cherokee people who went to Washington, D.C., but they were not official representatives of the tribe. But they signed a treaty that they shouldn't have been allowed to sign. And then they went back, and there was another group of the leadership who said, we're not going. So basically what happened in the end, the small group did leave in, I think, 1832 or 33. The rest of them remained in Georgia and some North Carolina, Georgia area. But in 1838, even though Justice Marshall had said this really wasn't constitutional, Andrew Jackson and the government said nope, and he sent the militia in to round up all of the Cherokee. And they were put in basically camps, stockades, and kept there until they were able, until there was an agreement that they would leave. So they were given $5 million in relocation expenses, and they gave up 7 million acres of land. 7,000 soldiers went in and rounded all of the Cherokee up, men, women, children, put them in the stockades, and then divided them into 9 what they called detachments. And when I told you last week that my great-great-great-grandfather was what they called a conductor on the Trail of Tears, he then was responsible for one of those detachments. And so the detachments were not led by the U.S. military, they were led by Cherokee natives. And they walked the 1,200 miles from Georgia to Oklahoma. 5,000 of them died. It took, I believe, from September to February. I know for the detachment that I know more about. There were different routes that they took. There's lots of stories out there about that. So at the time, then they ended up in Oklahoma, on the land in Oklahoma. Not a reservation necessarily, a reservation, but they had the land there. And they reformed their government and went on. But they lost a lot of their tribe in this act of just removing people off their land. Another, yes.
You said this walk took place in the winter?
Yes. Yeah. So they lost a lot of people. I know when I was in Little Rock, Arkansas a couple years ago, the chief of the Cherokee tribe at the time, his wife actually died on the Trail of Tears, and you can visit her grave in Little Rock. So they were close to making it, but she didn't make it there. The Black Hawk, that is an Illinois story. Some of you might know this story. It is actually one of the deadliest stories of Indian removal. The Black Hawk were moved to Iowa, so again, west of the Mississippi. They were moved to Iowa, but in 1832, they got a notion that maybe they had not moved, that the treaty they signed just wasn't quite right. And so they thought that they could come back to Illinois. And so the tribe came back to Illinois, thinking that they could because it was their land. Remember, we're talking a difference in how people look at land. They came back and they were all killed. You can look it up and learn about the Black Hawk. You've probably heard of the Black Hawk Wars, but that's what happened, was they thought they could come back. They couldn't. Or the government said they couldn't. And they just went in and killed them all. How many people know a little bit about the Black Hawk? You've probably heard a little bit about it. It's interesting to read, and when I had Representative Mark Walker here in the summer to talk to the youth about the artifact returning in Illinois, he talked with them about the Black Hawk coming back into Illinois, and they're actually really working hard to return some of these artifacts that we've, over our years, seen in museums and things like that. So I know Mark Walker, his office is just down the street and around the corner, is very passionate about this topic. I think you're right. Yeah, we're going to talk about Abraham Lincoln in a minute. No, I don't think so. Later, maybe, when he was president, we're going to talk about him in a minute. Any other questions? Amy?
I don't know if you've heard of this band. It's called Paul Revere and the Raiders.
Yes, I've heard of them.
Well, there is this Cherokee Nation. There's a song.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, I played it. It talks about, they showed it. It's a song. Paul Revere and the, it's like a 60s song.
Okay.
It's like Paul Revere and the Raiders, and they talk about the Cherokee Nation.
I think I've probably heard it. I
Yes,
just
and
can't, I forgot about it.
I
Thank you.
I could play it on my phone, but nobody could see it.
Any other questions or comments about those two events? All right. The Trail of Tears, it's something like I've learned about since I was a child. So interesting, though, to learn like so much more as an adult about it. You know, the only thing I knew about it was that the Cherokees walked across the country, but I didn't really know all the details of it or how it even came to be. But really, we can go all the way back to that doctrine of discovery, where then people came in, wanted the land, the people weren't Christian, and here's what happened. Come on. Oh, there we go. All right, so the Dakota Wars. The Dakota were moved when in 1859, when Minnesota became a state. The Dakota were moved, but because it was just you're going here. This is our land now, and we don't want you here. By 1862, many of the Dakota people were on the verge of starving, and they were in the Dakotas. Areas now that I told you last week I visited, I know Barbara's been there. I'm looking to see if anybody else, I don't think so. But they were on the verge of starving, and so the Dakota people had an uprising, which happens in any groups where you're starving, you have no money, you have no land anymore that you thought you had. So there was an uprising, but the U.S. militia came in and they rounded them up. Most of them, many of them, they made walk to Fort Snelling, which is near St. Paul. So they had to walk there. But there were 303 men who were actually arrested as part of the uprising. And those men then were put on trial, and they were sentenced to death for fighting in this, quote, war. But there was an appeal of this death sentence for the 303 men. Abraham Lincoln was president at the time, and so he reviewed all of the files, and he decided that only 36 of the men actually had to be executed. And so on December 26th of 1862 was the largest mass execution in the United States, not just of any people, but of Native Americans. All 38 Dakota people were hung in front of a very large crowd all together in one, I can't think what you call the gallows, yeah, all of them in Mankato, Minnesota. 38. Largest mass execution in the United States for an uprising over land that they thought was theirs. How many people have heard of that one before tonight? Especially if you've been in, because we live in this area and have maybe heard of it. Sand Creek Massacre, 1864. How many people have heard of that one? That was actually in Colorado. So we're back in the Southwest now. The tribe that was living there was camping around the Sand Creek area. They thought that it was an okay place to be. They were not uprising. They were not causing, quote, trouble of any kind. The U.S. militia went in and killed most of the men, women, and children. And when you hear about scalping, and how many of us grew up thinking that it was the Indians who were scalping us, it was really the Sand Creek Massacre. The U.S. militia scalped the Indians and then hung their prizes on their uniforms and their gear. They basically take your hair and the top of your scalp. Yeah. Hard stories. What? Yes, a way to keep count. Okay, one more. So the long walk. How many people know about the long walk? One. So this was something that I learned quite a bit more about this spring on the PCUSA travel seminar. The long walk was in 1864. And because I grew up always knowing about the Trail of Tears, I hadn't really thought a lot about other tribes. And all of these things I'm telling you, they marched the Dakota to Fort Snelling, and all of these different people who walked all these places. So the Navajo, who's the second largest tribe in the United States, I did not know a lot about the Navajo until this year. The Navajo were, in the 1860s, there was a large movement to really turn all of the Navajos into Christians. And they kept trying, and they were rounding them up. Eventually, in 1864, they rounded up as many of the Navajos as they could find, and they marched them, I believe it was about 400 miles from their homeland that is in New Mexico, Arizona area, marched them to a place called Bosco Redondo. And that was basically a concentration camp, for lack of a better term. How many of you know about Indian fry bread? Fry bread? So it's made from flour, baking soda, water. And a lot of people think that that's like some kind of indigenous food. And a lot of Native Americans eat it to this day. Everybody loves it. It's actually considered, when I went on the travel seminar, every church we visited, until the very last one, because somebody called ahead and said we had been eating Indian tacos every day. But it was considered like this great meal. They are really good. But the reason those came to be was because all the Native Americans had to eat. They had to eat flour, baking soda, water. And so that's where fry bread came from. It is not an indigenous food. Most of their food comes from the land and the ground and herbs and those types of things. So the Navajo were in this camp for about 4 years. Many, many, many died. And finally, in 1868, a treaty was signed between the Navajo and the U.S. government, and they were able to return to their homeland. Of course, they had to walk back to their homelands. And so now the Navajo Nation is actually surrounded by their 4 sacred mountains, north, south, east, west, very important to Native Americans, the directions and the sun and the moon. I was very privileged that we traveled so many miles on that seminar that I actually saw all 4 sacred mountains. And we had one of our trip leaders, no, 2 of them were Native Navajo. So it was it was just really meaningful to be able to see those. There was one group that went to Bosco Redondo originally, but how many people have heard of Kit Carson? He was actually part of the Long Walk. He was the person who went in. You can see in the background of this picture, this is Canyon de Chelly. And if you visit Canyon de Chelly, that's near Chinle, Arizona, you can actually see little like cave type things in the walls of the rock. And that's where the Navajo hid from Kit Carson and his group that were rounding them up and then marched them. This picture, I'm not sure you can see him. Canyon de Chelly is sacred ground to Navajo, but it is an amazing. I felt like after I was there that I don't need to go to the Grand Canyon, which I never made it there. But Canyon de Chelly is just this unbelievably beautiful place, and protected because of its status as a sacred ground for Native Americans. What? Canyon de Chelly is in Arizona, right near the Arizona-New Mexico border. So Navajo Nation now has its 4 sacred mountains, and it's in what's called the 4 corners. So Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah. And the Navajo Nation reservation is quite large and quite spread out. Any questions? Yeah.
So, I don't know if I understood this right. So some of the walks, they was moved out, but they had land and stuff. But this walk, they walked to a concentration camp, so they wasn't free, so to speak?
Right. So for 4 years, they were not free. They were in a camp. And then they signed a treaty, and they were allowed to return to their homeland. So just like the Pueblo people still live on their original native land, so do the Navajo. Whereas tribes from the southeast were moved west of the Mississippi. So like the Cherokee, really, their native homeland is the southeast. But, No, they're staying in Oklahoma.
So was this the only walk that they ended up in a concentration camp and not just to live?
I'm not sure. I haven't done enough research to be able to tell you. The Cherokee,
The one that we talked about tonight.
yes, the Cherokee started, they rounded all the Cherokee up, put them in a camp, but not for 4 years. It was a much shorter time. And then once they had it all organized, then they marched them to Oklahoma. But the Navajo story of resilience for those who were able to return to their land, to me, is just incredible. And if you ever have a chance to go to that part of the country, it is just remarkable, the resilience of the Navajo people. And they have a lot of challenges still. Any other questions on Jerry?
Well, when you spoke about the Indians that had to go west of the Mississippi,
Mm-hmm.
what about the ones that were in New England or Jersey?
So
Those tribes are still there.
some just did not leave. Some left and some have gone back. Some had treaties that allowed them to stay on small parcels. So they may have had thousands of acres and now they just have a small, there's a tribe on Long Island that used to take up most of Long Island and now they just have a small little piece of that.
When you're on Long Island, there are so many Indian names.
Yes.
So many.
Yeah. And they actually, have you seen their new, quote, billboards that they put up? They're more like big signs, because that's the only thing they could do to make some money. So.
I have been in a couple of Indian casinos.
Yep. So after hearing this, I know we're getting close to running out of time, but I just hope that as you spend Thanksgiving with your family and friends, you might remind yourselves of the things we've talked about and think, is there something you could do differently? Maybe it's just telling some of your family some of this story. Amy? You're right about that. You're right about that. They did not.
And there was no pumpkin pie.
You're right.
I Googled that too.
Amy, I'm actually awfully impressed of all the research you did.
It's on my phone. I don't know, I just like to look at stuff.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
I just like to look at stuff. It's like,
Does anybody have like an idea that they're like, I'm going to do this, or you don't have to. I was just curious.
Do you have any kids?
I don't have a lot. I'm one of the things, but it's because I was able to travel to this area. I became kind of very interested in a couple of organizations. So I think on Thanksgiving Day, I will probably make a donation to one of those. It's not much, but I like to make sure that my family kind of knows, the history, and it's hard. Well, I'm a lot of different things, to be honest. I'm Norwegian, Cherokee, Scottish. I'm so many things. So, come on. So, not next week. I forgot to change that word, because next week we will not be here. But the week after, I hope you'll all come back we are going to talk about what the U.S. government and partnering faith communities decided to do next, because the Native Americans survived. I think what the U.S. government thought was that they could just move them out and they weren't going to make it and they would be gone, but they didn't. And so what happened next? The boarding schools, land allotments, all those kinds of things were moving up kind of into the 1900s to see what went on next. So that's what we're going to be talking about in 2 weeks, not next week, but 2 weeks. And, come on. So I'll say this because I was going to make it larger, but I couldn't. So I just thought I still like this, and so I'll read it for you. If anybody can read it and wants to read along with me, that would be great. But this is a Cherokee prayer blessing, and that is Park Hill Presbyterian Church in Park Hill, Oklahoma, which is near Tahlequah, which is the Cherokee Nation capital. May the warm winds of heaven blow softly upon your house. May the Great Spirit bless all who enter there. May your moccasins make happy tracks in many snows, and may the rainbow always touch your shoulder. And this is actually a picture of Canyon de Chelly. It's huge. This is just a small part of it. So I just thought I'd add that at the end. But thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Hope you come back. Anybody's interested in looking at any of the books or taking a picture of the covers, you can get lots more details in those books. Thank you very much. They are. I just brought more copies in case people didn't.